GBHnews.org.
I'm Tori Bedford. Tonight on Greater Boston, faith leaders in the city are calling on the state to put more money into public housing. I'll speak with the organization behind that push about what that extra funding would go towards. Plus, GBH's Callie Crossley joins me on how communities are fighting back against book bans. And finally, Cuban-American Ana Hebra Flaster shares her story from the stage. Public housing is a lifeline for thousands of Massachusetts residents for whom the rising cost of housing has pushed other options out of reach. But for many, public housing also comes with a catch, including mice, mold, broken windows and doors. And in the Ruth Lillian Barclay apartments in Boston's South End last fall, the elevator was out for nearly 2 weeks, stranding disabled residents in their homes. It's why faith leaders are urging Beacon Hill to increase its public housing budget by nearly 75%, as the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization laid out in an open letter to state officials. I'm joined now by GBIO co-chairs Reverend Stanfield and Phil Hillman and State Senator Lydia Edwards. Thank you all so much for being here. So let's just talk about how this letter came about. I know you've been on this fight for a long time. Phil, if you want to kind of give a brief synopsis of what you laid out in the letter and what was kind of the impetus in putting it together.
Well, Burns is probably the better person to talk about the letter since he's one of the pastors who signed it.
And happy to say, so we've been working on it for a couple of years. We're concerned about housing because we operate out of the values of our different faith traditions and also the concerns that we hear from the people in the pews. And we have some legislation we're working on and really felt that it was time to add our clergy voices to the political work we do and put it in the mix. So the letter was created in a short period. We had over 150 signatories to it.
There have been some statewide efforts to increase housing stock just in the last couple of years. You know, what are you hoping that this contributes to that?
Well, the big push for the letter is to help get leadership, Senate and House leadership, to get the legislation through, over the finish line, as we like to keep saying. And as you mentioned, it's been a deep campaign, a long campaign, and it was the time to get that over.
Senator Edwards, you recently wrote a piece in the Boston Globe emphasizing the need not just for more housing stock, but for equity to be emphasized. Can you talk about why that's important?
Well, I think it's really important that that we take this moment and the funding that's coming through a bond bill, $4.1 billion, and say this is the time to build, but it's also a time to reflect on how we got here, that we don't have enough units for everybody, that they're incredibly unaffordable, that we have highly segregated, racially segregated housing, that we have lower homeowner rates amongst people of color. These weren't just accidents. There were policy decisions made by political people many years ago to implement redlining, to refuse to allow for multifamily zoning, to decide that some people will be close to work and others will be making a 2-3 hour commute. All of these were conscious decisions. And I think as we go to build a better future, we have to do so with an eye towards equity.
Right. In 2022, 177 MBTA communities, so communities within the zoning of the MBTA were required to comply with new zoning regulations to build more housing. There's been a ton of pushback about that, right? And not just from communities that have said that they will not be able to, but my colleague Sarah Betancourt recently wrote a piece about how the infrastructure of some of these communities, leaders there fear that they will not be able to deal with things like sewage systems, right? By building more multifamily housing, that it will overwhelm the existing infrastructure in their communities. Have you come up in this, has the state come up against speed bumps like that? And how are those kind of smaller, detailed issues being approached?
So I want to be very clear that the MBTA laws that people are oftentimes concerned about are planning laws. They're requiring that the city and town plan for additional units. There's no requirement that they start building them immediately. There's also not a lot of funding necessarily. We're working on it with the bond bill for them to be able to put shovels in the dirt. So it's really a matter of an exercise for cities and towns to imagine and vision together some more density in certain areas of their communities. That's the first and foremost. And then in terms of the resources necessary, I actually think that's going to really push them to engage in a back and forth with the state, saying, okay, we've done our part, we planned a certain way, but there are certain resources we need in order for this vision to come to fruition. We need the money, we need the infrastructure dollars, we need we need to make sure that we have more Chapter 97 funding for our schools. We need to make sure that we have all of these things in order to make sure this vision comes to fruition. So I actually think this is a first step. This is not a moment where we should be saying no, but more how can we come together to do and build that, to do right and build that future.
Right, and as these issues come up, I think the attitude, right, has to be, okay, well, how can we overcome them, right? Because these individual communities are asking for more resources. In the letter, you talked about, Phil, this Affordable Homes Act, right, which is, I wouldn't say, it's been passed through various committees. It would give $4.1 billion towards the creation of more housing. What is kind of your goal with that? I know that's a big push in the letter as well.
Well, there are two major pieces that have been a part of our campaign from the beginning. One is the public housing piece, where it's $1.6 billion for public housing. And this is to go after years of deferred maintenance. And that's why you need such a large number. The other piece has been the revenue generation side, which is the real estate transfer fee. We're in a housing crisis. And at the end of the day, we've got to build more units. And if we're not building more units, then you're not going to impact this crisis. And the question comes up, where does the revenue come from? And the real estate transfer fee is an opportunity for towns as a local option. They can choose to opt in or opt out, but an opportunity for them to raise revenue that then goes into an affordable housing trust. You can use that trust for first-time home buyers. You can use that trust to invest in more affordable housing. So these are the things that I think we need to really look at if we're going to take the tools and apply them to a crisis that we're in.
A recent Boston Foundation report found that rates of homelessness and those in Massachusetts residents who are at risk of homelessness, that those numbers have been skyrocketing. They do a point-in-time count. The National Housing and Urban Development Department, and I think last year in 2023, there was a total number of individuals, and I think this is, again, a point-in-time count of just over 19,000, and around 13,000 of those were families. I think what happens here if we don't build this, right? Like, what happens if we don't accommodate this crisis when so many people are on the brink of becoming homeless?
Well, we're seeing some of that with the current crisis. And of course, there are important things to do through direct service right now with that crisis. A lot of our institutions, we're 50-some institutions, churches, synagogues, et cetera. A lot of us are doing that in our own communities. Shelter, food. We have a bed set up in our church to accommodate a family if needed. But we need something systemic, and that's what we're thinking of right now. We focus on public housing because these are resources. It is a precious resource that the state already owns, but in many cases cannot use because we haven't taken care of it. Right. So the bond bill is, let's take care of this, which is one piece of a bigger puzzle, of course, but it's a really important piece.
Right. I mean, the infrastructure that we have that exists beyond just producing new housing is falling apart. I'm wondering what you're hearing. You mentioned earlier from the clergy and from the people in your communities and the people who you see at church. What are you hearing from them about their housing conditions?
One of the big issues is the ability to lose this dream of owning a home one day. I'm so busy paying rent that I can't envision saving the kind of money that's necessary to buy a home here in Massachusetts. And I think one of the downsides of what we're going to see is people leaving Massachusetts to go to other places, simply because they want to own a home one day. That's still a dream for many people, the dream of home ownership and the wealth that you can start to build having a home as an opportunity.
And I will say that just this morning, a few hours ago, I heard from a parishioner, and the landlord is selling. She's petrified that she can't stay in our neighborhood. and she has a decent middle income, you know, and she takes care of 2 kids, and her mother lives with her, and she is now petrified that she will not find a place in our neighborhood in South Boston or in Boston, and her children are in Boston public schools, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very real issue for pastors and everybody day to day.
Yeah. Senator Edwards, you are the chair of the Senate Housing Committee. You talked about how we got here. Where do we go? Where do we go from here? How do we ameliorate this immediately?
Well, I think that there's been several major steps that the state house has made, or the state legislature has made with Governor Baker with the MBTA laws. That was one, in lowering the threshold to allow for multifamily zoning. And also now we have funding with the bond bill. We also have a lot of policies, as mentioned previously. There's a transfer fee. There's ADUs as of right. There's a lot to do. About, say, 25 pieces of legislation are attached to the funding. So where do we go from here is we learned the lessons that we should have learned when it came to how we got here, as I mentioned, with redlining, as I mentioned, with the racial wealth gap. All of those different things are footprints for us to say, if we're going to go forward and we're going to invest $4.1 billion, it's going to be for a future that's more integrated, that's more equitable, and a future where the dream of home ownership is not dead. And that's what we need to be guided by.
Great. Senator Lydia Edwards, Phil Hillman, and Reverend Stanfield, thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Requests to ban books are at a 20-year high in the United States, and here in Massachusetts, several libraries and school districts have taken controversial titles off their shelves. All of these efforts are facing a lot of pushback from students, librarians, politicians, and avid readers across the country, including GBH News host Callie Crossley, who joins me now. Callie, thank you so much for being here. So we're seeing, I mean, you know, I was provided this list of schools that have removed or restricted books in Massachusetts as of January 7th, 2024. They're all predominantly white schools: Abington, Ludlow, Marblehead, Medfield, Melrose, you know, North Attleboro, Sandwich, Westwood, Wrentham, and Wilmington. You know, and across the nation, we've seen librarians and teachers get fired for fighting back against these kind of bans. What's going on with this push? And it seems like there's a war right now about banned books, in not just in educational climates, but everywhere.
Well, I don't think there has been a big enough war until, you know, maybe the last year, where there's been a lot of pushback against the bans or attempts to ban, which I celebrate. I'm a big reader, and librarians, both school librarians and public librarians, have been instrumental in my life in terms of expansion and just in general opening me up to other worlds. So the fact that somebody would ban some books that might have been instrumental in my growth, and I know how instrumental they will be to the growth of other young students, particularly because the fight is really about, it's for a lot of banned books across the board, including adult banned books, but the fight is really about the soul of young readers. And the effort being put into it, and the reason you mentioned that those districts were mostly white is because the targeted books are LGBTQ and or by authors of color, or content by LGBTQ authors and or by authors of color. I mean, that's been the focus.
And why? Why is that?
Well, because some people think the LGBTQ books are, quote, pornographic. The other part is that they think that the people of color who are writing are woke, for God's sake, and have an agenda, when actually what they're writing about in both of those camps are lived experiences which have very much a connection to students. And I just want to speak about, for me, with those school librarians and those public librarians, knowing that I was a child of color that could have benefited and did benefit from having books that would celebrate me, even by authors that were not BIPOC. So one of my favorite stories when I was a kid was Pippi Longstocking. I mean, because she was totally different, and I felt different in a lot of instances. And what did that do for me? It was great. So to think that I wouldn't be able to read that, or some other kid who's a white kid couldn't read about experiences by kids of color or other people writing about that, well, not only is it anti-American, it's just disgusting and scary. And, you have to remember that when they come for you in these countries that want to shut down information, they start with the news business. We know that. And then the second step is at the libraries, because if you can shut off information or the expansion of anybody's ideas, there you go. So for me, I'm celebrating the RuPaul's of Drag Race, RuPaul's Drag Race, fame, for getting out there right now with a rainbow book bus. I'm celebrating the librarians who have sued and won in cases where they've claimed to be discriminatory cases because of the choices they made for students in the libraries.
Talking about RuPaul's Rainbow Bus Tour,
yes.
RuPaul's also a partner in a publishing firm that supports these banned books or supports books from authors of color and LGBTQ subjects, and just has been a huge proponent of this. Has said this is education and knowledge is power. And I think what you're talking about in your experience as a kid too is that there is an agenda, right? I mean, that word agenda is used in it's just a sinister word, but it really is about supplying something to a kid where they feel seen when nothing else like that exists, when you feel so different, right? And then you read something and you feel validated by it. It though comes with an acceptance that there are kids on the LGBTQ spectrum. There are kids of color.
And those who aren't, who want to read about it, by the way.
Yes, right. It's not just for them, but it's so that everyone can create a kind of acceptance. And so maybe it's more about just a refusal of accepting those things. The RuPaul thing is interesting too, because drag queens and librarians who have both been subject to censorship have teamed up and joined forces on so many different platforms. This is a clip of a Lush's banned book drag queen story time with Cornbread Jate. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, but it's a drag queen who does a series on YouTube for kids where she'll just read kids' children's books.
What's up, everybody? It's me, Cornbread the Snack Jate, and this is Lush's Banned Book Storytime. In each episode, one of your favorite queens, that's me by the way, recommends a children's book that has been banned or challenged in the United States. This is in order to stand with the educators and the librarians that are fighting the good fight to keep essential stories on school and library shelves across the country.
So that's the Cornbread Jate episode of the series by Lush. But that's, fighting the good fight, right? There's been so much push about this.
Yeah, I just met Cindy Rowe, who's the president of the Jewish Alliance for Law and Social Action. And they are fighting on three fronts, local organization. First of all, they're fighting book bans by having a banned book club. Next book up discussion on Zoom is March the 27th. Then they're pushing for legislation that's sponsored by a couple of our local State House guys and women to make sure that we can ensure that there is not the kind of discrimination going on affecting librarians particularly. And then the third thing they're doing is setting up a project in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to create a private lending library, because there a lot of the books have been banned that we've discussed. And so those students will be able to have access to books that have thus far been banned from both public and school libraries. I mean, there are so many examples happening now. We need all of them. The American Library Association has just set up an across the nation effort called Unite Against Book Bans. I mean, this is something that each of us can get involved in. 700 attempts to ban books all last year, and Massachusetts is fourth in the highest number of attempts to ban books. So we're not exempt, and we need to pay attention to it.
And all this is happening as well while we are anticipating in a few days, I think, the release of this documentary, Butterfly in the Sky, about LeVar Burton. And he has been consistently an advocate for reading and education, and also against banned books.
And they released it originally in 2022 for the Tribeca Film Festival, but this is the moment where they felt like the filmmakers, it's time to bring it out again, just to talk about the joy of reading. That was a whole point of Reading Rainbow. And I mean, you couldn't do it more. That we just had National Read Across America Day. Governor Maura Healey took part in that. There are all of these attempts to make sure that we are on top of it. And my thing is, parents, if you want your kid not to read a certain book, that's on you. Stop making it impossible for the rest of our kids to read it.
Yeah.
Keep it in your house.
Yeah, I think a lot of those kids will seek. If I was a kid, I would say, ooh, I want to read those banned books.
Well, the digital public library is making it possible for you to go online and you get free access if you're in a state where they ban
Good
books.
to know. Callie
Yes.
Crossley, thank you so much. Thanks for your time.
You're welcome.
When Ana Hebra Flaster was 6 years old, she left her hometown of Havana, Cuba, to make a new life in New England. She shared details of her early life in Cuba and the complicated emotions she felt before, during, and after her family's move to the United States with GBH's Stories from the Stage. We bring you that story now as part of a partnership between that show and this one.
November 1967. I'm 6 years old. I live in Juanelo, Cuba, a working-class suburb of Havana. 4 generations of my family live all around me. Windows and doors are always open. Everybody knows everybody's business. Most of the adults work at factories nearby, and while they're working, the abuelas, the grandmothers, watch over us, and they're really good at what they do. If you even think about doing something bad, one of them shows up and ruins everything. But something really weird is happening in our neighborhood, and I can't figure it out. Every now and then, a family disappears overnight. The adults say, oh, they flew away to Florida, whatever that is. I'm just not sure what's going on, but I know that those disappearances are connected somehow to the sound of a motorcycle coming into the neighborhood. My parents aren't quite happy, and I realize that something's going on with them as well. They had applied to leave the country, and they had applied for their exit papers 3 years before, not knowing if or when they would ever get them. They had supported the revolution in the 50s like most working-class Cubans, but after the revolution, instead of getting the restored democracy that they had hoped for, they got ration books, propaganda, repression, and executions on live TV. So somewhere in the mid-60s, they decided, come hell or high water, we're getting out of Cuba. So one night, I'm at my abuela Cuca's house, who lives right down the street from us, and I'm chasing chickens. She had these skinny little hens that I love to chase around, and I hear a motorcycle coming into the neighborhood. So I want to figure this out. I take off down the street, round the corner, and in front of my house is a huge mob. And on the sidewalk is an enormous motorcycle. Inside, my father is sitting at the kitchen table and he's answering questions that this government guard is asking him. Back here, my mother's running around packing a suitcase. And over here is my grandmother Fina, Abuela Fina, who lives with us. That's my other grandmother. And she's holding my baby brother in a death grip, shaking and crying. I go over and I'm shaking and crying. And I'm asking questions about kids. You know, nobody ever tells kids anything. But the guard notices me at that point. Niña, ven acá. Girl, come over here. Is it true that you want to leave your house and your friends and never come back? And my mother and my grandmother and my father answer for me, sí, ella quiere. In no time, we're out on the street. And I look, and the guard is locking the front door and sealing it shut with a banner that years later I find out reads property of the revolution. He tells us to be at the airstrip tomorrow night at 8 o'clock, and the following morning we will fly out to the United States. So that night we spend at my uncle's apartment right above ours, and people start to show up to say goodbye. My great-grandfather, all kinds of relatives, and then my first grade teacher. I love her, but I don't know what to do with her in that setting, and I don't want to look at her. My mother comes over and says, Anita, your teacher was very brave to come here tonight. She came to the house of a gusano family. Gusano means worm, and that's what the government called people like us who were leaving Cuba. So she was brave. I want you to be brave. Ponte guapa. Make yourself brave and go and say goodbye. So I make myself brave and I go out, and she's kneeling in front of me and her tears are just falling down her face, and I lose it. Every bit of confusion and fear just explodes. And I'll never forget the feeling. It was like I was going to float away. It felt like I was going to just lift up and go away. The next night, it's 8 o'clock at night, and we arrive at the airport as instructed with 200 other gusanos all around and lots of little kids. And at first it's a blast because we're playing and we're running around, getting dirty even. We're in our best clothes. But then there's nothing to eat when we get hungry, and there's no place to sleep when we get tired, and there's some crying, and finally everybody just falls asleep on top of each other. All night long, over the loudspeakers, names are called out, and what's happening is that the government is harassing the people who are leaving, and they're scaring them, telling them all kinds of things that are going to keep them there. But we get out, and the next morning we get on the plane, and right before we take off, the attendant comes down the aisle and sprays us with disinfectant, air freshener, I don't even know. I know that it must have felt like a slap in the face to everyone who was there. Next couple of days, we spend in a refugee processing center outside of Miami. We get boots, coats, hats, get put on a plane, and somehow we end up in Nashua, New Hampshire. But I'm fascinated because there's snow taller than I am, and icicles hanging from roofs, and I have a brand new teacher to love. And at night we get to watch Gilligan's Island and learn more English. And our favorite show is Los Orejones, the big-eared ones, which you guys call Star Trek. And my parents have new jobs at a rubber boot factory. But I'm very worried because I keep finding my mother in a dark room in the house crying. Mommy, what's the matter? I have a headache. But I know she doesn't have a headache. And my grandmother doesn't stop crying from the moment she wakes up to the moment she falls asleep. And we sleep together like we did in Cuba. And at night, I can feel her shaking, and when I put my arm around her, sometimes she stops and we fall asleep like that. And I have my own issues at night too. I, for the first and only time in my life, am hearing voices. They come out of nowhere. I can't sleep. They come in waves. They're angry and piercing, and I can't understand what they are saying, and I cover my ears, but I still hear them. And I don't tell anybody, ever, that story, and I guess I was trying to be brave. The one thing that does make everybody happy in the house, the adults, is when we get a letter from Havana, from the old women who never forgot us. And I have those letters now. They've been folded and unfolded so many times that they're like Kleenexes. Sometimes the old women are saying nothing important, a little of this, a little of that, but even if it's a bad event, they're always optimistic somehow. And I imagine that in every line of every letter, they are sending us a message, an unwritten message. Ponte guapa. Make yourself brave.
You can catch Stories from the Stage in person next week at the Women in Action event. For tickets and more info, head to gbh.org/events. That's it for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for watching. I'm Tori Bedford. Good night.